we will begin with prayer. Now, I'm sure that some of you, when you received the email, were a little bit surprised at which direction we're going in with this one, considering that, Christmas is over and we just celebrated the presentation, the meeting of Christ with Simeon and Anna. This topic, let's say it's kind of like a last hurrah for Christmas. Now for us as Byzantines, so all the major feasts have a period of time that they are celebrated. And so although the presentation, or as we call it, the meeting of with Simeon and Anna, although that was celebrated on the 2nd, tomorrow is actually the last day of the feast. And so we're still kind of in that, in the season of that feast. And one of the things that I think is very interesting, we have, as Catholics, so there have been a lot of new feasts added on to the church calendar. Feasts, that are somewhat biblical, but not necessarily biblical, so mercy, divine mercy, different feasts like that have been added on. But do you know that there is no feast of the flight into Egypt? Did you ever think about that? And there is also, of course, no feast of the return from Egypt either. So it's kind of, it's something that has bothered me, I guess, for a little bit. The feasts are put together, technically, they end up being put together with the feast of the massacre of the innocents. So the feast of the Holy Innocents. So it's kind of put as well, that happened. And then because of that, Jesus had to be taken out of Egypt, so that he would not be killed. So it's kind of put together there in a rather clumsy way, because it's not like there's actually, there are not specific prayers. And then, of course, the other thing too is that immediately after the meeting, the presentation, so then we kind of jump forward in the tradition of the Gospels to when Jesus is 12 years old. But this was an important thing. So anyway, so that's one of the reasons why, because this, in a sense, it connects to the Feast of the Presentation, because it's something that takes place after, if we're going historically, it takes place after the presentation. We'll talk about that a little bit as we get into the theme of this event, because since it's not a feast, we have to call it something else, so let's call it an event. But so I'd like to share with you as our opening prayer a hymn that is focused on the Mother of God, that is specific to the matins for the feast of the meeting with Simeon and Anna, or the presentation of Jesus. And it's a beautiful composition, so laden with a lot of theology. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Virgin Theotokos, hope of all Christians, protect, preserve, and save those who hope in you. We, the faithful, saw the figure in the shadow of the law and in the scriptures. Every male child that opened the womb was holy to God. Therefore, we honor the firstborn son of the unbegotten Father, the firstborn son of the unwedded mother. O Virgin Theotokos, good help of the world, protect and guard us from all necessity and sorrow. The people of old offered a pair of doves and 2 young pigeons. In their place, the godly elder and the sober-spirited prophetess ministered and gave glory to the Virgin's child, the only begotten Son of the Father, as he is brought into the temple of God. O pure Virgin Mother, that which was fulfilled in you is beyond the understanding of angels and mortal men. You have committed to me the exceeding great joy of your salvation, O Christ. Simeon cried out, "Take your servant who is weary of the shadow, and make him a new preacher of the mystery of grace, as he magnifies you in praise." The pure dove, the mother lamb, without blemish, brings the shepherd and lamb into the temple of God. Holy Anna, sober in spirit and venerable in years, reverently confessed the Master freely and openly in the temple, as she proclaimed Mary, the Theotokos, magnifying her in the presence of all. O Maiden Mary, enlighten my soul, which is grievously darkened by the passions of this life. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So it's although we read it kind of as a continuous prayer, there are actually 4 verses. And in between the verses, there was always an exclamation of praise to the Mother of God. And so it's better when it's sung, but I'm not going to be singing it. So it does bring us, though, into this feast of the presentation or the meeting, which is, unfortunately, I think it's not as celebrated as it should be, because it is the meeting, it is the feast that connects the Old Testament with the New Testament. You know, everything that's happening in the event of the Nativity, if you think about it, so it's a bit confusing because, although there are the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, those who are charged with preparing the people of Israel for the coming of the Messiah, they themselves are oblivious. So when Jesus is born in Bethlehem, there is no one of the high priests or the Pharisees or the scribes or the government, even from like the court of Herod. There is no one who is there and who says, "I've seen these signs and something will happen in Bethlehem." And the ones who are called to come and meet and worship the child are shepherds, and shepherds are simple folk. They themselves most likely could not read and write. And because they could not read and write, they would not be a part of the community at the synagogue. So because the way that, at least at that time, a boy or a man became a part of the synagogue was to go and unroll the scroll of the law and read in public. So hence, if you could not read, and you had to read it in Hebrew, even though that was no longer the language of the land, the people did not speak Hebrew. If you could not read, then you were not considered a fully fledged member of the community. Now, they could go to synagogue. They participated, of course, in the events that are celebrated and throughout the Jewish year. Many of these events are celebrated in families, and these shepherds probably had families, but they really didn't have time to dedicate to studying scriptures. So then this event, which brings angels to them and then calls them to go to venerate this child, for them it must have been somewhat baffling. We do hear in the gospel account that they were scared. And that is a normal reaction, because angels don't just show up out of the nothing and, to converse with humanity. So when angels come, people are afraid. And we hear that echoed also in the text of the Annunciation. We hear that even with Saint Joseph and his dreams. So the shepherds had no real intellectual preparation to understand the mystery. And then, of course, we move on to the next ones, to the Magi. And the Magi themselves, they're foreigners. However, they do read the signs. So they see the star, and it brings them to the Holy Land. And so they go then to Herod. And of course, they figure that since Herod is the ruler, and he's I guess you could say kind of a nominal ruler, because he is appointed by the Romans to give the people of Israel the semblance of some freedom, that they're not completely under the Romans because they have a ruler who is Jewish. But Herod is not of the line of David. He is a collaborator, and he is the one who keeps the people kind of placated and quiet, while he makes sure taxes are collected, and he does everything possible to retain his power. And that includes killing off quite a few people, including some people in his very own family. And so he will, he's consumed by jealousy and anger, and he's fearful of losing his power. So this is someone who is really troubled in many ways. And so when we read in the gospel, we read that Herod was troubled. And then it says this beautiful little phrase, and with him all of Judea. And that's kind of lets you know that this guy was a control freak who was desperate. And all the people knew that if he was in a bad mood, it was going to be a bad day for them all. So the Gospels in many things are quite detailed. And so this is nice, when we read it, we get a sense of, even though he technically didn't have power, he had some power. And so Herod is another one who's in the dark and is actually working against this entire mystery and promise of the Messiah being fulfilled. Herod did do a few important things. So if you go to the Holy Land, there are still places where you can see what he did. For example, if you go to Temple Mount, so you'll see these enormous chiseled stone, not bricks, but they're enormous stone boulders that are chiseled and form the wall that holds up Temple Mount. And a part of that is still there is the Wailing Wall, where Jews go to pray at the wall, and very often also have bar mitzvahs, which is when a young man reads from Torah. And so he is responsible for that. He expanded the area of the temple to a certain degree. The temple could not be changed in its measurements because the measurements were given by God. But he made it more of a visible um, and powerful symbol by having it kind of, in a sense, built up a little bit. His hope was that, if I'm going to do this, that the people are going to like me. He was just seeking approval. They still didn't like him. He also built a number of other things, including the fortress at Masada. And Masada would become very important in Jewish history, especially after the fall and destruction of Jerusalem. It was the place where Jewish zealots and religious leaders had their last stand with the Romans, and they then, before the Romans were able to conquer them, they and all the people, including women and children, committed suicide. And so it's one of the great historical fights for freedom. So he built that place. Now, he also, as we know, he also perpetrated the massacre of the innocents. And, sometimes we get people who are asking, well, where's the proof of this? Why isn't there some mass grave, or why didn't anybody write about it? Well, there is a mass grave. It is actually under one of the churches outside of Bethlehem. And it is a cave that is filled with, I don't know exactly how many, but it is over 200 skeletal remains of children from that period, all under the age of 2. The other thing also that we do have, there is a Jewish man who became the historian of the Roman Empire, named Josephus Flavius. And Josephus specifically mentions Herod and that he had hundreds of children executed. So that is, I would say, enough of a historical record. So we can say that this did indeed happen. But when Jesus was, taken out of the Holy Land, so it is based specifically on the gospel account in Matthew chapter 2. And it's a short enough text, and it is right after the departure of the 3 magi. Well, as a footnote, nowhere in the gospel does it say 3. So they could have been, a nice caravan of 11. We don't know. But they have come down to 3 because there were 3 gifts. And so it was thought, well, maybe each one had a gift. And so they don't accept, maybe they could have gone in on a gift together. But nonetheless, there are not 3 in the gospel tradition. The other thing too, just to keep it, because we hear about the massacre of the innocents, that Herod decreed they would be all the children 2 years old and younger. So the kings, unlike what we usually see with our nativity scenes, or even with the icons, we see the nativity, and then we see the shepherds and the magi. And so we put them all as if they all came to the stable or the cave. And they didn't. Because in the gospel, we actually hear that they came to the house. So they visited Jesus later than when he was in the stable. And it says, and actually it's in the Gospel of Matthew, and when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother. So that's why we have that window of 2 years and under. And a part of this, just as a, I guess, a trivial fact, which uh, is interesting too, when Herod had sent out his men to round up, to find all these children, boys under the age of 2, he was aware that one of the priests from the temple in Jerusalem also had recently had a son. And so he summoned him before him and asked him, "Where is your son?" And because this priest did not want to tell him where his son was, so he had him killed in the temple itself. And this priest is none other than Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. And so it's interesting how all these different connections come together. So the Gospel of Matthew tells us the following here. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt and stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him." When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." And that is a reference to the text from the prophecy of Hosea. So why Egypt? Because after all, he technically could have gone back up to Galilee. He had family there and connections. He could have gone to Nazareth. Herod was the king over Judea, not the king over Galilee. And Galilee was a mixed area. So it was a place where he could hide. But one could deduce that it was too close for comfort. That with Herod, he had connections. And if there was something that he could find out or even send someone to assassinate, because he did do that, then it is possible he would be able to find the child. Egypt was a place that was familiar to the Hebrews. There was a long history of relationship with Egypt and its people. And this history begins on a very good note. It begins with Joseph, who is taken to Egypt as a slave and becomes a trusted confidant of the Pharaoh, and then saves the entire kingdom of Egypt from famine. Because of that, he is able to bring his brothers to Egypt. And if you remember, so he is the son of Jacob, and the sons of Jacob were 12. These 12 were the division of the tribes of Israel. Jacob is also referred to as Israel. And so these brothers, they stay in Egypt, and their presence becomes a semi-permanent presence. And so they are there, they are productive, they are working. They're not exactly slaves. So it's not like they, like for example, with Babylon, where people were rounded up and removed. They came to Egypt, they provided services, were a part of society, learned the Egyptian language. actually began to forget their own language. They also began to get a little mixed up religiously. And so their identity was beginning to also mix. But among the Egyptians, as they saw this minority community in their country, they realized that they were having more children, that they were becoming more numerous, and that eventually they might outgrow the Egyptians. This is it's the story of humanity. We've got so many times when you've got these different political leaders, who have used that exact same reasoning to either kick out people from their country or to try to annihilate them. So this is nothing new. It is nothing, unfortunately, unusual. And so with that, then begins the problem. So Egypt has this kind of a good history, a bad history. Then Israel goes to the Holy Land. But then with time, a lot of people end up moving back to Egypt, because Egypt, especially the city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, became a city that was very multicultural. And many Jews were part of trade and had businesses. And so many of them were attracted to this metropolis, this enormous city. I mean, you could compare it to cities like, Los Angeles or New York. It had port, it had trade, it had commerce. It had everything that one could dream of. And of course, because of the large amount of people, it was also a city that had a lot of money. And so that attracted people also. So by the time of Jesus, there was established in Alexandria and in other parts of Egypt a rather sizable Jewish community. It was a community that was religiously very observant, but they also had become Hellenized, which means they became comfortable and fluent in Greek. So they were no longer, of course, Hebrew had already kind of been forgotten, because even the people in the Holy Land were not speaking Hebrew, they were talking Aramaic. And these people who had lived in Egypt, who were there already for many generations, so they also did not know Hebrew other than to use it for synagogue prayers and study. And they also didn't speak Aramaic. Because of the nature of these two Jewish communities, so the Aramaic speaking Holy Landers, and then the Greek speaking and culturally Greek diaspora, these two in the time of Jesus and even before, they were constantly at odds. And the main reason was that the people in the Holy Land, the people who were living in the land of Israel according to what God had promised, so they felt that they were more religious and observant and not contaminated, because they also lived in communities where they would not mix with Gentiles. And that was the exact opposite for the diaspora. Even though they tried to live around synagogues and in ghettos and communities, and even wear clothing that would identify them as Jews, they spoke Greek, they did business with people who were not Jewish, with Gentiles, and sometimes there were things that happened that weren't exactly kosher. For example, in some places, they were forced to pay for sacrifices to pagan gods, because that was kind of like a tax. So if in a city you had a famine or some natural disaster, so the pagan priests would say, oh, this is because we have really gotten Zeus angry, so now everybody needs to pay up. And so they would force all of the different groups, even if they were not Greek, to pay so that they would take away that offense. And so, and of course, the people who were in the Holy Land, so they were like, see, they're not good Jews. They're offering to pagan saints. Remember what God did to our ancestors when they came out of Egypt and worshiped the golden calf, so there was a little bit of a conflict there. And I think the icing on the cake is that in the Holy Land, we'll call them the Holy Landers, the Aramaic speaking ones, they were under scrutiny and supervision. I mean, they were almost imprisoned in their land because the Romans didn't trust them. And every couple of years they tried to have another rebellion. And so, so you had different groups like the ones mentioned in the New Testament, the Zealots. There were many groups who were waiting for a moment to overthrow the Romans or to do a rebellion or cause a problem. And when you read the gospel, so for example, remember when Pontius Pilate comes out and asks the crowd who they want, Jesus or Barabbas? And so then in the gospel, it says that he finally relented because a riot was breaking out. And so, he as a Roman, there are a lot of soldiers. He could have just called them in to come and, kill a few people so that he would make a point. But the problem was that there in the Holy Land, in Jerusalem, everything was volatile. And so if there would be if he would push back, then they would push back again. And so he was trying to keep it from getting worse. And so the whole of the Holy Land, from before Jesus's time, so already before even Herod became a ruler, there was this feeling of rebellion and tension. And so because of that, Egypt had a community that was Jewish and flourished. And they were well-to-do. They could do a lot of the things that the Jews in the Holy Land could not. And one of those great things that they did was that they translated Hebrew scripture into Greek. And so that's the Septuagint. So this text, and it is a text, I'm bringing it up because it's a part of the feast of the meeting or the presentation. Because what was done, 70 translators who were fluent in Hebrew, but also fluent in Greek, meaning they were native speakers. So these were Jews of Egypt. So they were brought together to translate the entire Hebrew scriptures. And the translation occurred rather miraculously, that it was done as a joint effort with overlapping translations. And then finally, when all the translations and all the different parts were brought together, those parts that had been translated by multiple scribes and translators, it was found that they completely matched each other, that there was no need to change the text. And so it was considered a miracle. And, even though the Holy Landers might have objected to the translation of the text into Greek, ultimately it became very important because it was a way of sharing scriptures with people who were interested in Judaism, and there were many converts. It was also a way of sharing the faith with all those other diaspora communities, because there were all around the Mediterranean world other communities in the city of Rome, in Athens, as far as in Spain and in North Africa, countries that were not in that sphere of Egyptian Judaism. But they all benefited from it because Greek was the language of the intelligentsia in Rome. It was a language that was very spiritual and theological and malleable. They could create words. And so this was a great accomplishment. And so, according to the tradition of the church, one of these translators who was working on the translation of the text of the prophet Isaiah, was having some issues translating the text from Hebrew into Greek. And so when he came to one of the pieces of this text that spoke about a virgin who would become pregnant and bear a child, he was thinking that this probably should be translated in another way. So not to use the word parthenos, which is virgin, but to use the expression that would signify young woman. The young woman would become with child. And so he was working on this translation, and this is occurring about 250 years before Christ. Okay? So the translation of scriptures, of Hebrew scriptures, into Greek occurs 250 years before Christ. That means before Mark Antony and Cleopatra and all of those historic figures that we are familiar with. With them comes the transition under the Romans. So they are in Egypt translating when it is still Egyptian rulers. So this man who is working on the translation, he has a vision of an angel. An angel comes and speaks to him. And the angel tells him, do not change the words. Make sure that you use the word, the virgin will be with child. And when he questions the angel, so the angel tells him, you will see this fulfilled in your life. And so the church's tradition, and of course there's no way of like proving this, but the church's ancient tradition is that this man eventually moved close to the city of Jerusalem. And he spent many days there studying and praising God in the temple. And his name is Simeon, the elder. He is the bridge between Old Testament and the New Testament. And so that's why he's so, the church says, and this is found even in the fathers too. When we read the text about like his desire, now you may dismiss your servant in peace, and you're kind of like, well, now that you've seen Jesus, don't you want to be one of the people who goes and tells other people about this? But if you think about it, it's like, how long has this guy been alive if he wants to die? Well, about 300 years. So that's why he's old. So, but that is that is one of those interesting connections. Now, not only is it a connection though to the Old Testament and someone who understood the Hebrew text as well as spoke fluently Greek, but he was also Egyptian. So Egypt still is kind of like this thread throughout the Old Testament that comes all the way up to Jesus. And so Jesus's parents, Mary and Joseph, they decide to go to Egypt, number one, because the angel said so. You don't argue with angels. And so, but the secondary reasons are because Egypt was outside of Herod's reach. He had absolutely nothing in Egypt. Egyptians had their own local authorities and rulers, and they had things set up completely differently. And because of Egypt also being an ancient culture that was Hellenized, that was, became culturally Greek, they looked at people like Herod and the people in the Holy Land, they looked down on them, as kind of like hillbillies. So there was no chance that Herod could go after them. Secondly, politically speaking, where the Holy Land was kind of volatile and there was a lot of danger of things happening and riots and assassinations and stuff, Egypt was pretty peaceful. It was not all that crazy. And the third reason, there was a clear highway for travelers that was called the Coastal Way. And it went from the Holy Land, from what is today Lebanon, all the way along the Mediterranean. It was a safe route. There weren't these sketchy areas where thieves and marauders and pirates could be waiting to rob people. So it was a safe way of traveling all the way down to Egypt. And it brought them pretty much into the Nile Delta by the city of Cairo. So not Alexandria, but Cairo. And Cairo was an ancient city. Cairo was a very important historical city for the Egyptians. And it was from there, from Cairo then, that they began their journey into Upper Egypt. Now, just as a little sidebar here, Upper Egypt is southern Egypt. Lower Egypt is northern Egypt, where the Nile Delta flows into the Mediterranean. And that is because Upper Egypt is there where the Nile River begins. And so it is there that it flows the strongest. And then as it gets up farther north before hitting the Mediterranean, it kind of fans out into a number of different tributaries. And so the heart of Egyptian society, Egypt is a lot of sand, a lot of desert. And so around the river, that was the lifeline of the entire of Egyptian civilization. No river, no life. And the actual, just in case you want to know it, the origin or where the Nile River begins is in Ethiopia. So it flows from Ethiopia into Egypt. And so the Holy Family make their way on this safe road going to Egypt, where there are many people who are like themselves, people who are Jewish. And it seems that as they travel, they don't go, from the Holy Land and like straight for a certain destination. There was no Airbnb or, Travelocity to figure that out. And so they make their way into Egypt, and probably Joseph is working odd jobs as a carpenter, and that keeps them going until they finally do get farther south, and there they establish a home. Now, you might be thinking, okay, where is Father getting all this information? Well, we're very blessed because in Egypt, there is an ancient historical Christian presence. And for them, for their church, this part of the story is what they are most proud of. That with the way that God revealed himself in the midst of the people of Israel, that he specifically sent his son and Mary and Joseph to Egypt is not just coincidence. And it's not just, the only option they had. And so there are signs within the Old Testament that tell us that this is going to happen. So the prophet of the coming of the Messiah, our favorite Christmas prophet, Isaiah. Isaiah has in chapter 19, he has a vision that he shares, and this is a rather baffling vision, I'm sure, for the people who were listening to it, because after all, the Egyptians are not the Israelites. They're Gentiles and pagans. But this is what he writes, and I quote, "Behold, the Lord sits on a swift cloud, and shall come to Egypt, and the things made by hands in Egypt shall be shaken by his presence, and their hearts shall be overcome within them." He's speaking about the Egyptians. "Egyptians shall be stirred up against Egyptians, and a man shall fight against his brother, and a man against his neighbor, city against city, and law against law." And then, continuing in verse 19, "In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the country of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. It will be a sign forever to the Lord in the country of Egypt. For they will cry to the Lord because of their oppressors, and the Lord will send them a man who will save them." He's speaking about the Egyptians, that they will cry to the Lord and he will hear their prayer. "He will send them a man who will save them. He will judge and save them. Then the Lord will be known to the Egyptians, and in that day the Egyptians will know the Lord and offer sacrifices. Yes, they will make vows to the Lord and pay them. The Lord shall strike the Egyptians with a great wound and completely heal them." So, and what he's describing is, these are all messianic things, that miraculous healings, all of this, conquering their enemies, all of this, these are signs of something special for Egypt. And so this is one of the texts that the fathers, when they read this from the Old Testament, they see, well, there is something to be taken from this. There's something deeper that is being revealed here. This is not just some, nice little nod to the Egyptians, but this is a very specific revelation where Egyptians will recognize the Lord God of Israel, but also of Egypt. Now, the text that is quoted in the Gospel of Matthew is the text from the prophecy of Hosea. Hosea is approximately 800 BC. So way, way, way back. And Hosea writes this, and this is a small little reference. For Israel is a child, and I loved him. And out of Egypt I have called his children. As I called them, so they departed from my presence. Out of Egypt I have called my son. The reference to son in this text can be understood two ways, because God does refer, not only in Hosea, but also in other prophets and prophecies, he does refer to Israel as his child or children. And so it's not something that is difficult to interpret, because there is a long-standing tradition. But it is understood that with the use of son, it is a more charged word. Because in Hosea, children is used. So the word is used, but then son appears also. So then what is the meaning behind it? See, this is how all of the Old Testament, it's always, we read it and then consider the New Testament. So somehow God, and I think this is important to reiterate, because the Old Testament is a difficult read. And I know that a lot of Christians struggle with the Old Testament, because it is it's a story of a nation. It is the story of God preparing a people, so you can get caught up on the historical details. There's a lot of stuff there that's a little violent and brutal, and, things that are, not as easy to read and understand as the New Testament. Then when you get past the historical part and you start reading the prophets, it gets even worse, because all of that, it's like, okay, how do we connect the dots? But ultimately, the fathers say, even if you don't understand this, it's okay. You don't need to read this text and have a complete clarity about what God is saying or what he is doing. But if we follow the fathers, and many of the fathers have written commentaries on, the Song of Songs or different psalms and prophecy of Isaiah, so there are many different fathers who have taught. And so when we use their perspective and guidance, that can help us to kind of, unpack some of what we're reading in the Old Testament. And so that's when you get like these wonderful titles. There is the, in the Roman Catholic tradition, there are the litanies of Loreto, which are litanies about the Mother of God. And most of those are Old Testament references. And so you read it and it sounds, poetic. But if you don't understand that it's coming from the Old Testament, it kind of, it's just nice words, but it loses something. And the fathers are telling us, when you read the Old Testament, God is so in love with humanity and wants this reconciliation and wants us to know him, that he can't help himself but already throw a lot of hints about what is coming. So that's why there are all these little details that are like precursors. They're little things that you read and it seems to be like out of place. What is this doing here? And and terminology that's like really, really specific for no obvious reason. And so there are like a lot of these little signs in the text that tell us something is coming, something greater. And the reason why we're getting these little messages is because he really loves us so much. He wants us to know him. That's the good news. That's really the wonder that is the Old Testament. So don't get discouraged if you have problems reading it, or somehow it's a little too dense or too heavy or too depressing. There are concealed within that. There is so much love. There is so much revelation to come, and and that is why even now when we look at how Egypt becomes this place of refuge where the Holy Family goes to wait out the reign of Herod. There is so much that has been predicted and now is being fulfilled when it comes to that journey to Egypt. So going back to where we get this information. So the Coptic Church, which is the Church of Egypt, is one of the oldest Christian churches. The presence of Christians in Egypt is connected to the apostle and evangelist Mark. Mark came and evangelized the Egyptians and then died and was buried there. Later on, his relics were brought to St. Mark's in Venice, where they were kept. And now after, in the last 40 years, so significant parts of his relics have been returned to the Coptic Church, as well as to the Greek Orthodox Church of Alexandria. Sadly, there is a break. There are two communities in Egypt. So there are the Copts, who are still, they use the language of the ancient Egyptians, but written in Greek-ish letters. So some of the letters are like Greek, but there are also some letters that are created that are unique to sounds that don't exist in Greek. And so they preserve in their language, which is not spoken by all Copts, they preserve that connection to ancient Egypt. Now, in the 5th century, at the Council of Chalcedon, this is just, again, a little bit of a footnote. The Council of Chalcedon took place outside of Istanbul, Constantinople, we shouldn't call it Istanbul. That is the Turkish name. So the Council of Chalcedon argued about the natures in Christ, human and divine, one nature, two natures. And so it was there that the terminology was developed that is used by the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Catholic Churches, the Eastern Orthodox Church. The terminology that says Jesus Christ had two natures, so a complete and perfect human nature and a complete and perfect divine nature. For the Copts, so there was already in that time a split culturally. There were Christians who were Greek culturally and Christians who were Egyptian culturally. things kind of got lost in translation. And so that was one of the first splits in the church, was between the Copts and the Greek Orthodox. Today, even though there is still a separation, the two churches basically have the same theology. In fact, the same dogmatic theology, even as we do in the Catholic Church. They still will be ambiguous about the way that they refer to two natures. They won't say two, but they will say that each of the nature is contains the fullness of divinity and the fullness of humanity. So they're kind of in the same ballpark, but it's not really a theological problem, and that is because that that understanding was developed by Saint Cyril of Alexandria, who is one of the doctors of the church and one of the fathers. And so he lived before the time of the Council of Chalcedon. So they're still using a terminology which was at one time accepted in the entire Christian church. So that's just as a little bit of an explanation. The Coptic Church today is the largest Christian church in the Middle East. And from our perspective as Catholics, we recognize as valid all their sacraments. So including ordination, including communion, etc. So this community is connected to the apostle and evangelist Mark. And it was because of the early acceptance of Christianity. And another interesting side note is, by the time of Jesus, the worship of many gods among the people of Egypt and Egyptian culture, the worship of many gods had ceased. And most of the Egyptians by Jesus's time worshiped one God. And so the Coptic Church very proudly says that, because nobody knows how that happened. You know, when you go to the museum and you see Egyptian art, so you see, all these different gods and goddesses and Hatshepsut and, and the cats and et cetera, et cetera. And so how they went from that, which was rather complicated and sophisticated, and arrived at one God, is kind of an historical conundrum. We don't know. And so the Copts are like, we know, it's because God was preparing Egypt so that we could not only receive his son, but recognize him as God. And so they provide for us a lot of those details of where and how this journey happened into Egypt. So one of the texts, many of the texts are, of course, in the Coptic language. Some have been recently translated. And one of the texts that is available is actually one that became very popular in the Western Catholic world. And it was given the name, the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew. So false Matthew. And it has a lot of information about the childhood of Jesus. So its official title is Book About the Origin of Blessed Mary and the Childhood of Jesus. And very prominent part of it is the flight into Egypt. And so a lot of the things that we find in medieval art in Germany and Spain and even like in the British Isles, A lot of that art is because of this text. This text was popular reading. It was not a gospel. It was never part of the canon, but it was a kind of a spiritual theological text that filled in what a lot of people asked about. I mean, you think about it, while Jesus's ministry and teaching is very exciting and interesting, there are significant gaps. And I think a lot of us would be very happy to read a text that told us something about the childhood of Jesus. So it became popular because of that, and was spread because of monks and nuns who would copy things and then send it to another monastery, or if they moved, they would take it with them. And so it was eventually translated into Latin and became part a very familiar text. So by the year 800, it was very well known in the West. In the East, so it is guessed or guesstimated to be a text that came together in its final form somewhere between the year 500 and 600. And they figure that out usually by trying to figure out the way that the sentence structure is, because that kind of stuff changes after many generations. And so I just want to share with you some parts of it which are very beautiful. They talk about the journey. After having come to a certain cave and wishing to rest in it, Mary dismounted from her beast and sat down with the child Jesus in her lap. And on the journey there were with Joseph 3 boys, and with Mary a girl. And behold, suddenly there came out of the cave many dragons. And when the boys saw them, they cried out in great terror. Then Jesus got down from his mother's lap and stood on his feet before the dragons, and they worshipped him and departed. Then was fulfilled that which was said by David the prophet, "Praise the Lord from the earth, dragons and all you ocean depths." And the child Jesus, walking before them, commanded them to hurt no one. But Mary and Joseph were very much afraid, lest the child should be hurt by the dragons. And Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid, and do not consider me to be a child, for I am and always have been perfect. And all the beasts of the forest must need be docile before me." It's a beautiful little text. Very important, cave. And another detail which is also very important is this one where it says, "Do not consider me to be a child, for I am." I am is the divine name. So it's tossed into the text also. So then it continues on, and there are other animals that they encounter, specifically lions and panthers. And it says they adored him and accompanied them in the desert. And then it seems like Mary and Joseph are a little bit freaked out by the menagerie that's accompanying them into Egypt. But they're also noticing all of the things that are happening. And Jesus says to them, and specifically here says to his mother, "Be not afraid, mother, for they come not to do you harm, but they make haste to serve both you and me." And that's beautiful, because that's another, now he's not saying this to Joseph. So this is a very important reference to the veneration and the placement of Mary in the revelation of this plan of salvation. And so, another text which is also beautiful here. And it came to pass on the third day of their journey, while they were walking, that Mary was fatigued by the excessive heat of the sun in the desert. And seeing a palm tree, she said to Joseph, I should like to rest a little in the shade of this tree. Joseph therefore led her quickly to the palm and made her dismount from her beast. And as Mary was sitting there, she looked up to the foliage of the palm and saw it full of fruit, and said to Joseph, I wish it were possible to get some of the fruit of this palm. And Joseph said to her, I am surprised that you say so, for you see how high the palm tree is, and that you think of eating its fruit. I am thinking more of the want of water, because the skins are now empty, and we have nothing with which to refresh ourselves and our animals. Then the child Jesus, reposing with a joyful countenance in the lap of his mother, said to the palm, O tree, bend your branches, refresh my mother with your fruit. And immediately at these words, the palm bent its top down to the very feet of Mary, and they gathered from it fruit with which they all refreshed themselves. See, it's like, I wish this was in the Gospels. This is really awesome reading. But then it continues on then. And Jesus says again to the palm, raise yourself, O palm, and be strong, and be the companion of my trees which are in the paradise of my Father. And open from your roots a vein of water which is hidden in the earth, and let the waters flow, so that we may quench our thirst. And the palm rose up immediately, and at its roots there began to gush out a spring of water, exceedingly clear and cool and sparkling. And when they saw the spring of water, they rejoiced greatly and were all satisfied, including their animals and the cattle, as they gave thanks to God. So, and it continues. I mean, the journey continues with all of these miracles, which very importantly, and this is why, as far as like a historical text, okay, it's probably a little mixed with history and miracles. But there is this focus on the child who is growing, but who is very conscious and aware that he is also God. And so these things that are happening, in the words, there is a lot of theology that is held. And even the palm, because the palm, and this is, it's beautiful. I also think it's very beautiful because with all of the talk about like ecology and respect for nature and stuff. So when he talks to the palm, he addresses it as a living thing, a living being. And it seems as if it's an invitation, like the palm could actually say no. So he is inviting and asking the palm to do these things. And then it says, specifically at the end of this text, it says, this privilege I give you, O palm tree, that one of your branches be carried away by my angels and planted in the paradise of my Father. And this blessing I will confer upon you, that it shall be said to all who shall be victorious in any contest, you have attained the palm of victory. And it connects it directly to Palm Sunday. So I mean, it's beautifully constructed. And so okay, it may not be the historical text. I think we get lost a lot of times and distracted by this idea that everything has to be somehow proven, and that if we can't prove it, then it's fake and it's all deception. And we've lived through in recent years kind of a theological revolution that focused only on history, and then groups of theologians whose mission it was to disprove different things that happen in the New Testament or even in the Old Testament. So it's like, so we've gone through a lot of that. And so I think this kind of a text, you can read it as, the church telling a story and teaching through, poetic expressions, but it's not deceptive. It's based on the journey that did take place. Of course, those who are naysayers will say, well, you can't prove it, and it's only Matthew who brings up the flight into Egypt. Because if you go to, like, for example, Luke, there's no mention of the flight into Egypt. And actually, right after, because we read the Gospel of Luke for the feast of the presentation of Jesus and for the feast of the meeting with Simeon and Anna, we read the Gospel, and then it says that his parents took him to Nazareth. And so there's like a disconnect. But the problem that we also don't understand is that between the four Gospels, there are significant differences. There are some stories that are shared. There are some stories where the details are a little bit different between the Gospels. And there are some things that are not shared. And so there is a different importance that may be given and understood by the evangelist who wrote that. And that's okay. The four texts were not intended to all, blend together and become one book. They're all unique, and they focus on different parts of the message and different aspects of this revelation. So it's okay that the flight not be mentioned. But it is an event that is biblical, that is part of the church's tradition from the very earliest period of Christianity. Being connected to this whole thing of the nativity of Christ, and then the presentation, and then bookended by his revelation at the baptism. So this feast event, even though we don't celebrate it liturgically, it is actually celebrated in the Coptic Church. And the Copts celebrate it on the day that is according to the Coptic calendar. A lot of, like, there's a Hebrew calendar, of course, Jewish feasts are figured according to that. In Christianity, we've got the Gregorian calendar and the Julian calendar, which are also different. And so the Copts had their own calendar. And according to that calendar, the feast is celebrated on the 24th of the month of Bashans, which roughly coincides to June 1st. And it is called the Feast of the Entry into the Land of Egypt and the Escape from Herod. So it's now Coptic Christmas is, it is according to the Julian calendar, so it is on the 7th of January, which coincides with December 25th. So they do have this connectedness. As far as like the historically accurate or not for the time when they got into Egypt, I mean, technically this could be as much as a year and a half later. which might explain, that Jesus was already kind of spry on his feet. And he was talking. Well, I guess he would talk because he's God. So, but for that matter, probably walking too. But there is definitely, the child is not a baby or an infant. So they come into Egypt, and the first place they come is this town, which is today known, and actually it was known even in the time of Jesus, as Mostorad. Mostorad is a neighborhood of old Cairo. And there at that time, that was outside of the city of Cairo. And it is a place that has underneath it, there's quite a bit of water flowing. And it was a place where palms grew abundantly. And so there is the place that they stopped under the palm, and that was preserved in the local tradition. And today there is an ancient church that was built some 1700 years ago on that spot, and it is the Church of the Virgin Mary. Within the church is a spring of water that is still flowing. Then from there, they continued to the town, the area of Wadi el Natrun, and that is an Arabic expression. So the name reflects already the Arab conquest in the 7th, 8th centuries. And it is there that Wadi is a valley. And so inside that valley is the place where the Holy Family stopped because it was too hot. And so they stopped there under a tree for shade. So there are 4 monasteries there. Monasteries that were built at the end of the 4th century, among the first monasteries ever built. Wadi Natrun also has connection to many different saints like St. Anthony of Egypt, but also St. Marcella of Rome. Many people went there when they wanted to become monastic. They wanted to die to the world so that they could live in God. And so it was the new martyrdom. And so there in one of the monasteries is an ancient tree that is over 2,000 years old, and it is gnarled and nasty looking. It has suffered for 2,000 years under the unrelentless sun of the Egyptian desert. So, it's kind of pushed almost into the ground. And that's the tree, which according to tradition, the Holy Family rested under during their journey. As they continued, they came to the small town of Sakka. Sakka is close to the Nile River. And it is there that Jesus, who was climbing on one of the rocks, left in the rock the footprint of his foot, which is still there in a monastery. They came then to Old Cairo, and there they stayed briefly, intending probably to stay there because there was a good-sized Jewish community, and there on what was a temporary house for them is built the Church of the Holy Martyrs Sergius and Bacchus, church built around the year 400. Finally, they came to the area that was closest to the heart of ancient Egypt, Babylon, El Daraj, and the city of Heliopolis. Heliopolis, which was very famous. It was the city named for the sun. Helios is the sun, and for Egyptians, the sun god was Ra, and he was the origin of the pharaohs. So it is a city in the south of Egypt, which is Upper Egypt. And it was there that as they entered, the accounts tell us that as they entered the city, they were received by the people of the city, and all of the idols fell off their pedestals. And so it is there that they spent the longest duration of their stay before then returning back to the Holy Land. Now, it's beautiful when we also look at some of the writings of the fathers about the flight into Egypt and their stay in Egypt. St. Peter Chrysologus, in his Sermon 115, wrote, "Christ fled that he might make it more tolerable for us when we have to flee in persecution." So it's almost like he modeled it's okay to flee. Because remember, even though we have a lot of martyrs, God remains even with those who don't get martyred, who decide to leave and move. So, and then St. Gregory Nazianzus, in his oration number 28, he wrote this very simple, and this was specifically referencing the flight into Egypt. So the contrast of the land of Israel and the land of Egypt for Jesus. Every land and no land is his country. And then he also wrote it, every land and no land is my country. And so that's the understanding that the whole world belongs to God, the whole world. And so the whole world is also our land as Christians. But then there is only one home, and home is with God. It's heaven. And so in the same way, that is, of course, for Jesus. And he is, the reason why it's stated this way is because, again, Jesus is number one. And so if he does it or he says it, then that's what it is for all of us. And so there are many other references to the flight into Egypt and why it's important. Now, speculation as to why it did not make the events calendar of holy days, I don't know. I think that sometimes Egypt has a little bit of stigma, especially for the early Christians who were Jewish. There is, of course, that understanding of how God led them out of Egypt that might have something to do with the reason why it's not celebrated as a feast on its own. Because after all, it's an important event. And the beauty is that we have the opportunity to dip into the tradition of the Coptic Church and understand a little bit more about this event. And of course, the Coptic Church, when you go there and you visit these places, it is a tremendous spiritual experience. And one of the bishops who wrote and taught a lot explaining this to non-Egyptians in North America. So, and I'm paraphrasing this. So he stated that God chose the Holy Land and Egypt for the revelation of his Son. And so there is nothing more or greater that a believer, that a Christian can desire than to be connected to that heritage of faith in Egypt. And I figure that's also one of the reasons why in Egypt monasticism began. That's why in Egypt there are all these churches. And even after the decimation of Egyptian Christianity, they remain the largest Christian church in the Middle East. And they downplay their numbers today because the government is Muslim. And we've seen in Egypt, things have gotten really ugly. And these different groups, fundamentalist Muslim groups, have targeted Egyptian Christians between bombing of churches and shooting into churches on Sundays, because they see the strength of this suffering church, that young people are filling the churches. And, they went, if you remember, Coptic Christians from Egypt were the ones who were rounded up on the shores of Libya, where the extremist Muslims beheaded them on the beach. And even Pope Francis's reaction to that was to refer to them publicly as holy martyrs and saints. So even without canonization, even without them being in communion with the Catholic Church, it was, immediately recognized. And of course, to make it even worse, all of it was filmed, so you can actually see the horror of that fundamentalism. And so because of that, the Coptic Church tends to downplay its numbers because they don't want to be a target. And again, as what happened in the time of Moses, when the Egyptians realized that the Jews were growing, they turned on them. And so, of course, they see the same thing same thing is happening to them, because it's very difficult for Copts, for example, to get permission to build a new church. But if you want to build a mosque, it's very easy. So there is a double standard. However, the Egyptian Copts, and I know quite a few of them, they are wonderfully faith-filled. They are proud of their country and their heritage. They're proud of, being part of the Arab world. So they're not they're not escaping from Egypt. And they're a part of the government, even if sometimes the government turns on them. But, they are definitely, when it comes to the Middle East, they are the most consistent presence. And they take care of these monasteries and holy places. And, now that they've come here to the United States, so we're in Texas, we're blessed because we have one of their monasteries is located in Corpus Christi. And many people go there to visit, not just Copts. They're very famous for their hospitality. And of course, they're famous also for their iconography and for their patristics, especially from the monks. They're a church where all of their bishops are monks. So the presence of monasticism is very close to the spirituality, the heart of the Coptic Church. So um, we're blessed. We're blessed that we have access to that. And I found at Half Price Books, I found a great book that is The Escape to Egypt, Coptic Tradition. It's like, that is great. So I just found this recently, maybe a month ago, at my favorite store, Half Price Books. And this was really, even though I had wanted to do this before, when I saw this, I kind of took it as a sign. I think we need to kind of look at this to appreciate it a little more, because it's a beautiful part of the story of Jesus. And and that experience of Egypt is not just them escaping, but there's all of this stuff that is being echoed from the Old Testament. What Isaiah said about Egypt: out of Egypt I've brought my son. The Egyptians releasing the Israelites to go back to the Holy Land. There's so much history there from the Old Testament that this wasn't just some coincidence. This is definitely part of the plan. So that being said and done, I do have some pictures to show. So I spoke about the places that are associated with the journey. So this here, I read a little, like a meditation a couple of years ago on the flight into Egypt, and it started with when Jesus was brought into Egypt by his parents, that he saw the pyramids, he saw the Great Nile, he saw the Sphinx. It's like, and we don't think about that because all of that stuff was there. For them, it must have been an incredible thing to come into this country that has such an ancient history and is filled with these incredible monuments of its history. And then you think that, the child Jesus, the presence of God, right there in the midst of all of that history. So I think it's beautiful meditation, to consider, because in our world today, we have a lot of refugees, a lot of people who are escaping, from the war in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Now, a lot of people who are trying to get out of Turkey or to safer parts of Turkey with whatever they have left, or whoever they have left in their families. So this theme of flight is not something that is disconnected from us and from our reality. And so to understand, I think, to meditate on the flight into Egypt, the escape from Herod, and to understand just how severe, life-threatening that was for them. That's something that can help us also in our prayer as we remember those around the world and those even in our country, who are forced to flee. And so it's still very relevant, and and something that, although it has a shroud of mystery about it, the initial beginnings of it, and perhaps that's the reason why the church left it connected to the massacre of the innocents. Perhaps it was for that reason, so that we might not look at it as just a nice story about the Holy Family, taking a road trip. There's more that's going on here, and this is about, the safety and indeed the full revelation of Christ, even by those who hate God. And so, and again, and that's the irony. It's like, okay, those who hated God were the Egyptians at one time when they did all that stuff to the Hebrews, even though they could see that God was with the Hebrews, and they rejected him, but they got another chance. They're redeemed, and Isaiah's words are fulfilled. So, yay. Okay, questions? I think, as is very often the case for colonial powers, uh, they should function in a few languages, so, and the evidence of that is what was written on the cross, because that was done by the court, meaning and he was the one who judged. So that came from him. So I think Greek, Latin, and Syriac, because it's Syro-Aramaic. It was written in Hebrew letters, but it was actually, this is the way that it was done. The Jews they preserved the written language so that they could read Hebrew, but it was the language that was actually being spoken by the people that happened to be Aramaic. Because that's how, like, Yiddish and Ladino, which are other traditionally Jewish languages. So Ladino is a form of Spanish, Yiddish is a form of German. But if you're German or Spanish speaking, you can't read them because they're written in Hebrew. The letters are Hebrew. And so that was the same thing. And so what I would say that Pontius Pilate, especially since he seemed to be connected, like, to the priests and other people who came to talk to him. So either he had someone who translated, which is a very good possibility, or he himself was also skilled and was able to communicate in Syriac or Aramaic. I would doubt very much that, like, the priests who would come to him would speak to him in Latin or in Greek. Yeah, they were worried about basic things like, just remaining pure when you're close to a Gentile. Well, there's no doubt that it is a connecting back to what was originally created. So the original plan of God. We do recognize in the resurrection of Christ, we recognize there the beginnings of the restoration and renovation of all creation. So, the way that we approach life around us, it's not just about the people, but everything bears, the fingerprints of God, you could say. So if we are not respectful of creation and creatures around us, that's not a good thing. And so I do think that is one of the affirmations that is there in that text. So it does point to paradise. It does point to restoration, that, the palm tree that lives and dies here is still connected somehow to God's plan and to what God originally had created. So, yeah, and you can, so themes like water in the New Testament is a huge deal. And it's, between the baptism of Jesus, the first miracle of Jesus, rituals of purification, so water is everywhere. There's a lot of water. It is also in the Middle East, being hot and desert-like, it's an important commodity. And so, but God definitely uses the water. And so it's not, I don't think there's any coincidence. So when you read it, I gave you a few examples, but if you read it and put it together, you can actually find multiple connections. You can find a lot of other things. I wanted to just kind of point it out. That's kind of the patristic method to reading scripture, is, to see when you read something if it connects to something else. And so, and that's the wonder in it, because God, that's why the word of God is always kind of, it seems to be always alive. You can read the same passage 10 different times and get 10 different experiences out of it. In the Coptic iconography, and I'll send a couple of icons, like images, in the email. In Coptic iconography, so specifically for the flight into Egypt, the palms figure very importantly, as does the Nile River. So very often at the bottom of the icon, you'll actually see like little waves, and sometimes even fish. The interesting thing is that on that Irish stele from the 8th century or 9th century, you've got the figures, they look a little folksy. Underneath them, you got fish. So it's like, so these little details have somehow come through tradition. And palm trees in Egypt were also very important because they were indicators of where there was underground water. And so if there would be, you'd have desert. Of course, close to the Nile, you got, everything is very fertile. There's a lot of agriculture and plants and animals and all that. But when you get farther from the river and get into the desert, if you're looking for water, you have to look for palm trees. Because there, somewhere underneath that palm tree, there's going to be water. So they were important for the existence of the Egyptian dynasties and kingdom, because so those are you could say they're important elements of Egypt. Not so much other parts of the Middle East, not so much the Holy Land. Jesus refers to a lot of different plants and trees and figs and dates and all this stuff. But if you're going to say something, the Egyptian tree, palm. That's it. I think also the one thing that's a little like a fine, a different aspect to it, is that the translation of sacred scriptures into Greek was not so that they could share Judaism and its writings with the Greeks or with the Egyptians. It was done because of a need that they had within their own community. And so it became available. All of a sudden now it was available, so others did read it, especially early Christians. You hear all about these debates between like Origen and the rabbi, and this became one of the things because now it made sacred scriptures available to everyone who spoke Greek. Next week, we'll be talking, since we will be just a couple days before the beginning of Lent. So we'll talk about fasting and and how that fits in with almsgiving and prayer. because it's not just fasting. And and we also get a little caught up with the distinction of fasting and abstaining. And it's just to embrace it as a practice that is part of the early church's experience of Lent. And it is a positive thing. It is a thing that Christians look forward to because it is a spiritual pruning, a cleaning up, in preparation for the feast of Holy Week and the resurrection. So we'll look at some of the fathers, because I think the fathers give quite a bit of very practical guidance. And, that hopefully will also then inform your own observance of Lent and how you decide to do it. Because, the rules, as they say, the rules are meant to be broken, but the rules are also, they're a guide, a parameter, so you can build on top of that. And I think a better understanding of those rules will also mean a better Lent. Okay, you're welcome. Okay, bye-bye.